All right, guys, we are picking up at the very bottom of 167. There was a lock plate, but there was no keyhole. Jonathan leaned his pick up against a pillar and stepped back. "Don't dawdle," said Mrs. Zimmerman nervously. "Get that door open. I have a feeling that we're on the very edge of disaster." Jonathan stood there rubbing his chin. Exasperated, Mrs. Zimmerman grabbed his arm and started to shake it. "Hurry, Jonathan. What on earth are you waiting for?" I'm trying to think of door opening spells. Know any?" "Why not pull at it?" said Louis. It may not be locked." Jonathan was about to say that he had never heard of anything so stupid in all his life, but he never got the chance to say this. The door opened all by itself. Jonathan, Mrs. Zimmerman, and Louis stared. They were looking down a long corridor, more than mine shaft it was, really, with square wooden arches diminished into the dark distance. Something vague and gray was moving at the far end of the tunnel. It seemed to be getting closer. "Look!" cried Louis. He was not pointing at the gray shape. He was pointing at something that was sitting on the floor of the tunnel, right there at their feet. A clock. A plain old Waterbury 8-day clock. Its pendulum oscillated madly behind the glass door, and it was making a sound like a Geiger counter gone crazy. Here's the picture. "I'm so glad you've done my work for me," said a voice behind them. Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman spun around and froze, really froze. They could not move their hands or feet. They couldn't even wiggle their ears. They were completely paralyzed, though they could still hear and see. There stood Mrs. Izzard, or Mrs. O'Meager, or whatever name you choose. She was wearing a black velvet cloak with an ivory brooch at her neck. The brooch bore and raised Greek Omega. In her right hand was a plain black rod, and in her left she carried what looked like a severed hand, with a lighted candle growing out of its back. Concentric rings of yellow light spread outward from the hand, and through them Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman could see Mrs. Izzard's glasses, which looked like tablets of gray slate. "I do hope you haven't tired yourselves, my dears," said the old woman in a nasty, sneering voice. "I do hope you haven't, but if you have, it's all in good cause. I couldn't have done anything without you, not a thing, because you see, since I was set free, I've been able to pass through walls and doors, but these poor old hands of mine just haven't been able to wield tools. I even had to get Mr. Hammerhandle to find this for me." She let go of her wand, and it stood by itself, and reached deep into the folds of her cloak. What she brought out was a greenish copper key. She held it up and turned it around. "Pretty, isn't it? I told him we were to look, but he had to do the work. He's really been very good at following directions, and he's made it quite easy for me to set up light housekeeping across the street. But alas, that is all over and done with. You played right into my hands as I thought you would. Did you really think you had defeated me, you foolish old biddy? You merely hastened the day of judgment, and it is at hand. My lord and master is coming to meet us, and when he arrives, it will be a very different world. Very different, I assure you. Let me see. You two will change first, I think." She pointed at Jonathan and then at Mrs. Zimmerman. "Yes, that's the way it will be. You two first. So Sonny here can watch. You'll want to watch, won't you, Louis?" Louis stood with his back to Mrs. Izzard. He was as still as clothes store dummy. "Turn around, Louis," said Mrs. Izzard in her nasty, sweet voice she used from the beginning. "Don't you want to kiss your old Auntie Izzard?" He didn't move. "Come now, Louis, I command you. Don't be foolish. It'll just make things worse for you in the end. Turn around, I say." Louis's body grew tense, and then he rushed forward into the tunnel. He picked up the clock, which had begun to make a whirring sound. Clocks make when they are going to strike the hour. "Stop, boy!" shouted Mrs. Izzard. "Stop, you filthy fat pig! I'll turn you into something that your own mother wouldn't. Don't you dare, don't!" Louis threw the clock down. There was a springing of uncoiled springs, and a clatter of cog, and a splintering of wood, and a tinkle of broken glass. He reached down into the wreckage and ripped the pendulum free of the works, which were still buzzing furiously. At that moment, a figure which stood only a few yards from Lewis, the figure of an elderly man in a rotting black Sunday suit, vanished. Then there was an awful shriek, a loud, inhuman sound like the siren at the top of its wail. It filled the air and seemed to turn red. Lewis covered his ears, but the sound was inside his head and in the marrow of his bones, and then it was gone. He turned around. There stood Jonathan, smiling, trying to blink away the tears in his eyes. There stood Mrs. Zimmerman, smiling even more broadly, and behind them, on the cellar floor under a swaying bare bulb, lay a crumpled pile of black cloth. A yellow skull was staring up out of it, staring up in agape-jawed amazement. A few wisps of gray hair clung to the crevices in the smooth dome, and over the empty eye holes a pair of rimless glasses were perched. The glasses were shattered. Chapter 11. 3 days after the destruction of Mrs. Izard and her magic clock, Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman and Lewis were sitting around a bonfire in the driveway of the house at 100 High Street. It was a chilly night and the stars were cold overhead, but the fire burned a warm, bright orange. Mrs. Zimmerman had a streaming earthenware pot of cocoa by her side. She kept it close to the fire so it would stay warm. Jonathan and Lewis stared at the fire and sipped the cocoa from their mugs. It tasted very good. There was a pile of Isaac Izard's dusty papers in Jonathan's lap. Every now and then he would pick one up and throw it into the fire. Lewis watched each sheet as the fire licked at its corners, then blackened it, then wadded it into a fluffy ball of ashes. After a while, Lewis said, "Uncle Jonathan." "Yes, Lewis?" "Was Mrs. Izard really trying to make the world end?" "As far as I can tell, she was," said Jonathan. "And she would have done it, too, if you hadn't fixed her clock for her. But tell me, Lewis, why didn't you turn around when we did?" Lewis smiled broadly. "I looked at the glass door on the clock and saw the reflection of what Mrs. Izard was holding, and I knew it was the Hand of Glory John L. Stoddard tells you about in Hands of Glory." "I'm glad he does," said Mrs. Zimmerman. "One look at that hand and you would have been as numb as we were. But still, it took a great deal of courage for you to rush in and smash the clock. After all, you didn't know what would happen to you when you did that." Lewis was silent. He hadn't always thought that the courage had something to do with riding your bicycle through bonfires. He had always thought that courage had something to do with riding your bicycles through bonfires and hanging by your knees from limbs of trees. Mrs. Zimmerman picked up the plate of chocolate chip cookies and passed them around. Jonathan took 2 and Lewis took several. There was another silence while everyone munched and sipped for a while. Jonathan threw more papers into the fire. Lewis squirmed around and stared at the dark house across the street. "Do you think Mrs. Izard will ever come back?" he said in a faltering voice. "No," said Jonathan, shaking his head gravely. "No, Lewis. I think that when you smashed that clock in the walls, you destroyed any powers she might have in this world. Just to be on the safe side, though, I put what was left of her back in the mausoleum and locked the doors with a nice shiny new lock, a lock that had spells said all over it. That ought to hold her for a while." "What about the Hanchets?" said Lewis. "I mean, are they going to come back to live in their house?" Jonathan paused for a minute before speaking. He clicked the paper clips on his watch chain. "I think they are," he said at last, "but certain rites will have to be performed before they return. When an unclear spirit inhabits a house, it leaves behind a bad aura." "Speaking of bad auras and unclean spirits," said Mrs. Zimmerman, "do you have any idea what happened to Hammerhandle?" Jonathan's face grew grim for an instant, and then he made a few guesses about Hammerhandle's fate, but he had kept them to himself. For one thing, he knew that he was the blood of the hanged man went into making of the Hand of Glory. "No idea at all," said Jonathan, shaking his head. He seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. Suddenly, Lewis began to squirm and scrunch around in his seat. He was on the brink of saying something. "Uncle Jonathan?" Lewis's voice was dry and throaty. "Yes, Lewis, what is it?" I let Mrs. Izard out of her tomb." Jonathan smiled calmly. "Yes," he said, "I knew you did." Lewis's mouth dropped open. "How did you know?" "You left your flashlight up at the cemetery. I found it in a pile of leaves when I went up to put Mrs. Izard back in her tomb." "Are you going to send me to the detention home?" asked Lewis in a tiny, frightened voice. "Am I going to what?" said Jonathan, staring at him in disbelief. "Lewis, what kind of ogre do you think I am? And besides," Jonathan added with a sudden smile, "why should I punish you for doing what I tried to do myself when I was a boy?" Like you, I was interested in magic at an early age. It runs in our family. I guess I was trying to impress a girl. You wanted to keep Tarby for a friend, isn't that right? Lewis nodded sadly. By the way, Lewis, said Mrs. Zimmerman, how are things between you and Tarby these days? Not so good, said Lewis. I don't think Tarby and I were meant to be friends. We're not the same type. But it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, said Jonathan. Well, it certainly does matter. If he's such a stuck-up little... He stopped because he saw that Lewis was smiling smugly. Jonathan wrinkled his brows so that they looked like two mating auburn caterpillars. Louis Barnevelt, he roared. Are you hiding something from me? Louis was trying very hard to keep from giggling. Oh, nothing much, Uncle Jonathan, he said, except that I have a new friend. What? You do? Said Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman in unison. Yes, her name is Rose Rita Pottinger, and she lives down on Mason Street. She knows the names of all the different kinds of cannons. Want to hear them? Saker, Minion, Falconet, Demi, Convolverin. Ah, screamed Jonathan. He threw 2 fistfuls of paper in the fire. That's all I need. An expert in Elizabethan ordnance. Promise me one thing, Lewis. What's that? If you and Tiny Rosie decide to start a cannon foundry in our basement, let Mrs. Zimmerman and me know so we can visit my relatives in OC5 Hills, okay? Lewis giggled. Sure, Uncle Jonathan. I'll let you know. Jonathan waved his pipe at the bonfire. The leaves stirred uneasily, and they gathered into a large black ball. The bonfire turned into a jack-o'-lantern. Now the 3 of them took turns pitching chestnuts into the eyes, nose, and mouth of the ferocious lantern. Pop, pop, pop. The chestnuts went off in a ripping string, like a musket fire. Jonathan, Lewis, and Mrs. Zimmerman sat around the fire talking until the scowling orange face fell with an airy whoosh. Then they got up, stretched, and went wearily off to bed. And that is the end, you guys. You made it to the end. All right. On this one, I do want you guys to add a little bit more details about what you feel about the book. Put it all together and give me some sentences about how you're feeling about the end of the book, how you felt throughout the book, what your favorite part was. If you have seen the movie, you can do some differences between the movie and the book. If you have not seen the movie, maybe we can do something with that. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed it.